I know the Frankenstein film came out in October, but I had laser eye surgery last month and I couldn't make a video for a while because I was recovering. But here we are, I can finally see, so better late than never. I loved the Frankenstein film. I've already seen it 3 times. I honestly think that Guillermo del Toro honestly popped off with that creation. And I know a lot of other people that loved it too. So obviously I wanted to make a video on book recommendations to read if you love the Frankenstein film. I'm going to be focusing on the main themes in the film and recommending books based on that. And if you're new here, hi, welcome. I'm Katerina. I make videos about all things books, and if that's what you're into, why not subscribe? Before starting with the themes, if you haven't done so already, I would really recommend reading the original book Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. The fact alone a 19-year-old girl wrote this on a dare in 1818 and essentially created the science fiction genre is a huge slay in itself. The film is a little different than the book. It more focuses on empathy than horror, and it also delves deeper into toxic family dynamics and generational trauma. But I would still very much recommend reading the source material. I read the book years ago, and after watching the film, I honestly now want to reread it. But moving on to my recommendations based on the themes, the first category I have here is probably the most obvious one, and that's body horror. I don't know how much I can describe these books without getting flagged by YouTube for sensitive content, but I will try my best. But arguably, Frankenstein is the mother of all body horror because the creature was literally assembled from different body parts. The story mainly focuses on tampering with the human form and creating unnatural life from physical transformation. So starting off, the very first book I would like to recommend here is Poor Things by Alasdair Gray. This novel is actually set in Scotland during the Victorian era, and we follow a woman who is brought back to life by a very eccentric scientist. In her second wind of life, with absolutely no memory of her past, we journey with her as she explores through identity, autonomy, and love, all whilst navigating through a society filled with inequality and hypocrisy, particularly these Victorian values of gender roles of that time. The film adaptation with Emma Stone that came out 2 years ago is really an excellent film. I would actually recommend you guys to watch that. But it's how I learned about the original book, and it also surprised me to learn that the novel was actually full of illustrations as well. So if you actually prefer more visual books rather than just text, then I would definitely recommend this for you. But unlike more of the serious tones in Frankenstein, I would say that this overall is generally more lighthearted. While still being gothic fiction, it's definitely more of a satire, and it has a lot of dark humour throughout. But the book still has a good dose of body horror throughout because we get some pretty unsettling descriptions of the main character's creation, because literally both her body and her identity are reconstructed by the scientist. The novel also explores notions of physical limitations and the boundaries of life and death, and the moral and ethical dilemmas of tampering with the human body. Parts of this book can be quite vivid and gross, but if you like that sort of thing, then I think this book is definitely for you. And in a similar vein, another book that I'm going to be recommending here is Autonomy by Dana Schwartz. This is another historical gothic fiction novel that's actually set in Scotland. And we follow a young woman who, despite being barred from medical school because she is a woman, she is still committed in becoming a surgeon. And she links up with a resurrection man who can supply her bodies for dissection. But as they rob graves together, they uncover a secret about a mysterious illness that is an danger to society. If you enjoyed the romance aspects of Frankenstein, which I certainly did because, hello, it's Jacob then I would say that this is definitely more up your street because this story is basically a love story also. But it also focuses on themes of ambition in the medical sphere as well as the ethics of scientific discovery. And it goes without saying that body horror lovers will also dig this book, pardon the pun, because this is all about body snatching, dissection, and has lots of corpses. You know, everyone's favourite things. People that know me, especially people who I work with, say that I'm quite gothic and grungy, which I don't think I am, but then I read books like this and I'm like, maybe they are onto something here. But like with Frankenstein, this very much explores the boundaries between life and death, and this sense of fascination, but also unease that comes with that. For my next recommendation, this book is actually probably the closest to the Frankenstein story because its name is literally in the title, and that's Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed. This novel is set in post-invasion Iraq following the 2003 war, and we follow a man who collects the body parts of bombed victims and stitches them together to create a new body, with the purpose of hoping to give the dead as a collective a proper burial. However, the creature becomes alive and seeks vengeance on behalf of the victims it's made from. The novel explores themes of meaning in identity, the complexities of violence, and the consequences of war. This is probably the closest story you can get to Frankenstein without reading the original book. This is kind of like a modern day Frankenstein to me. But I particularly rate this novel for focusing on the negative consequences of war and how, above all, it's the victims that suffer the most, which we not only see in the film, as the creature is the one who suffers the most in the fact that he cannot die and pass on to the next life. But the discourse in war is actually one of the things I enjoyed the most in the Frankenstein film, and it's when Elizabeth speaks to Frankenstein about the monstrosity of war itself, the trauma it inflicts on everyone, and it's how the men that go into war suffer the most, whereas the men who are leading it are the least harmed while they're all cozied up in their beds. And it mirrors how, even though war seems like a good idea in theory, so does Frankenstein creating this creature. And it just shows how people end up suffering. Loads of people lose their lives at the hands of Frankenstein's creature, and it was a result of Frankenstein himself, which in the end, really, he suffers the least. It also goes without saying that this book is full of body horror. I don't think I need to spell that out for you. And also, I am someone from an Iraqi background myself, so I love plugging Iraqi authors, and the 2003 war is particularly close to my heart, so this book does a great job on showing the monstrosity that whole thing was. And for my last book in this category, this is a little bit of a rogue one, but we have Dr. Franklin's Island by Gwyneth Jones. I would say this is rogue because this is actually a young adult book, and I actually read this when I was like 14. But if you're not into the pure body horror because you find this too intense, then this is definitely of a softer version that I think would be better for you. This is a science fiction novel that follows 3 teenagers who end up stranded on a desert island after their plane crashes. And on this island, they're captured by this eccentric scientist who's conducting some pretty unconventional genetic experiments. And these teenagers are subject to transformation as they're basically turned into human-animal hybrids. And in the process, they confront ethical questions about identity, science, as well as freedom. When I was thinking of recommendations for this video, this weirdly was the first book that came to my mind. And I read it so long ago, and I actually struggled to remember the title, but this is such a cool but creepy book, and it definitely felt like a fever dream when I was reading it. But if you are quite queasy with body horror and the kind of physical elements that come to that, then I definitely think that this is a better option for you, because it doesn't really delve into the whole physical process of body transformation as such, but instead focuses on the genetic experimentation of turning into an animal, and more of the psychological trauma that follows, including the loss over your own body. And I like that it questions whether someone can keep their human identity even if their human body is taken away from them. I just remember this book being a bit weird and cool, and I very much enjoyed it as a teenager, so maybe you'll enjoy it too. Who knows? Moving on to the next category, which for me, this also was quite an obvious theme, but there's nothing wrong with keeping it simple. Sometimes you don't need to overcomplicate things. So the next category I have is monster classics. And though these aren't classical books that are big, but instead these are classic books that have monsters in them. And starting off, probably a classic that's pretty much as influential as Frankenstein is Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is arguably the mother of all classic gothic horror novels because it's literally centered around Count Dracula. He was a centuries-old vampire that moves to England from Transylvania in search of new victims. And the story is narrated through diary entries and letters and newspaper clippings. And we follow a group of people that tries to basically stop Dracula's outrageous behavior. If you enjoy the monster element in Frankenstein, this is genuinely a no-brainer to read next, because we have an iconic supernatural antagonist whose very existence challenges the boundaries of science. It also has similar themes of fear in the unnatural whilst also exploring notions of morality. And I also think that both stories have this very perfect blend of horror but also whilst having complex characters, which obviously makes it an incredible story. But if you already enjoy the monster element in Frankenstein, I think you cannot go wrong with this. Another book that's also a classic, which features perhaps a less obvious monster, is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is actually my favourite classic of all time. I was absolutely mind blown when I first read this, so I just had to recommend it in this video too. Again, another gothic novel. I am not joking when I say that I love my gothic novels. And this book follows a very handsome young man that's obsessed with his beauty and his youth. He's the OG narcissist. And whilst having his portrait painted, he wishes that he could remain young and beautiful forever. But be careful what you wish for, because his wish is granted, and his life turns very messy as he pursues a life of pleasure and greed. However, in the process, his portrait begins to mirror the morality of his actions and becomes increasingly more ugly. Similar to Frankenstein, this also has a creation of a monster through supernatural means, and I love how the messaging in Frankenstein is that the creator is actually the monster rather than the creature himself. And this has very similar messaging in the fact that the monster that's created is done by human doing, along with this whole idea that we should not base people on their looks because their character can be very different from what's on the surface. And I just adored how both stories have gothic tones but also moral dilemmas into what actually makes someone monstrous, along with this idea of unchecked ambition and how just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should. And yet another gothic classic that also includes a more subtle monster is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is set in Victorian London, and we follow a scientist who has managed to concoct a potion that allows him to transform into his violent and chaotic alter ego. And once he's transformed, he indulges in very naughty behavior without fear of consequences. However, the changes start to become more and more controllable, which means his actions become more dangerous. Also, like with Frankenstein, this story very much focuses on the creation of a monster through human scientific experimentation and includes elements of more psychological horror mixed with elements of identity and personal responsibility. I see this scientist in this story as the most similar to Frankenstein's scientist because it very much shows the dangers of this unchecked curiosity that comes in scientific experimentation and the negative effects that this can have. Plus, I think it's also the very classic take of transformation, but also looking at the darkened side of human nature, which who doesn't love a complex character? They make the best stories, so that's also why I'm recommending this book. And my last recommendation in this category is also a little bit rogue, but it's a classic book with lots of monsters in, and that's The Odyssey by Homer. I am purely including this book in this list because of Christopher Nolan's adaptation that's coming out next year, which I am so excited for. I am itching to read this book because it's literally hailed as one of the best books of all time. So this story follows the very famous Greek figure Odysseus on his 10-year journey back home following the Trojan War, and in his path he faces gods, storms, as well as many mythical creatures, including Cyclops and sirens, all while his wife is fending for his throne back home and his son is searching for news of his survival. Ultimately, this is a story of bravery, fate, and perseverance. I'm including this book because whilst Mary Shelley is the creator of science fiction, The Odyssey has some of the earliest and most iconic monsters that we know today. And despite being an ancient Greek classic, I actually think this book is a bit spooky. The main character's journey is filled with the supernatural, dark islands, and just eerie side quests. I also think, like with Frankenstein, The Odyssey runs into the same notions of morality and what makes someone truly monstrous. There's many different translations for this book, but I have been told by people that Robert Fitzgerald's translation is the best version to read, just because it's the most accessible and easy to understand, and a lot of the times classics can be quite difficult for people to get into, but if you have a good translation, it makes it more engaging and just more enjoyable to read. And finally, the last category in this video is a theme that's not as obvious as the other two, but I still really wanted to include it, and that's this whole idea of the main character playing God. Frankenstein attempts to defeat death and play with the limits of life by creating his monster, arguably playing God by trying to give life to something unnatural. So here the books are a little bit different to the sci-fi elements in Frankenstein, but instead focus on male characters who try to reign a lot of power and pass moral judgment onto others, playing all sort of powerful being in a way. So starting off first in this category, we have The Godfather by Mario Puzo. This book is centered around a very powerful family involved in crime that's led by the patriarch of this family, and he's nearly assassinated when a rival gang threatens their power. The son therefore steps in but becomes entangled in the mess as he seeks revenge and tries to protect those that he loves. And the novel is very much focused on themes of loyalty to family and the moral cost of violence. Obviously, the patriarch of this mobster family holds a lot of power and therefore imposes his own moral code onto others, because he makes the decisions on who lives and who dies depending on who has undermined him. But the book also shows the very heavy costs that come with trying to reign this godlike authority. Similar to how Frankenstein plays God, not even in just bringing his creatures to life, but also like going to death row and picking the body parts from the people he wants there. I also wanted to include this book because of the very complex family dynamics that are within the story. In Frankenstein, we see a very toxic relationship between him and his father and how this generational trauma is passed on through him. And The Godfather is very heavy in complex family dynamics, and I just felt like it was a perfect fit here too. Another book involving a man passing godlike judgment on others is No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy. This is a philosophical thriller where we follow a man who gets involved in a drug deal gone wrong type scenario, and a manhunt goes after him when he runs away with a suitcase full of cash. And one of those hunting him is a unhinged hitman who is the embodiment of ruthlessness and chaos. It very much explores themes of good versus evil and also the randomness of violence. Again, we have a male authority who is making judgments in life and death for others, which mirrors the moral power that Frankenstein has as he attempts to gain with his creation. The book also explores this notion of control versus chaos, which I thought was really interesting. The hitman essentially does a coin toss in front of their victims, which ultimately decides whether they live or die, meaning his victims can't control the the outcome, it's just purely random, which I think is very similar to Frankenstein in the fact that it proves that humans can never really control the outcomes of anything in life. Frankenstein had this very specific image of what he wanted his creature to be and was frustrated in the fact that he wasn't all-powerful and knowing in making the creature in his image. This book was also adapted into a film in 2007, which I think is a great film and would also very much recommend you guys to watch. And my last book in this category, and also this video, focuses on more of the negative consequences of trying to play God, and that's Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. The story is set in St. Petersburg, Russia, and we follow a desperate and destitute former law student. And driven by poverty and this belief that his own moral code is superior to others, he murders a woman in cold blood in order to rob her, justifying his actions in order to achieve a greater good. However, he's soon consumed by guilt, paranoia, and inner conflict, essentially leading him to madness. This is one of those books that I really wish I could just read again for the first time because it was truly remarkable. Again, we have this self-righteous man who really believes he's above it all, and he believes he has the right to decide who lives or dies because of his intellectual superiority, which I think is very similar to the justification that we can see in Frankenstein's actions. Both characters well and truly believe that they're above the ethical boundaries of life, and I really do rate this book for focusing more on the negative consequences that can come from having this mentality. The main character in Crime and Punishment literally descends into a frenzied madness when he realizes the horrific actions he's committed. And whilst Frankenstein gives life rather than taking it away, he's still horrified with his own actions and also low-key goes insane. The lesson of the story again being, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And there we have it. Those are all the books I recommend to you if you enjoyed the Frankenstein film. I already want to see it a fourth time because I honestly loved it that much. I hope you guys also enjoyed the film and also this video. If you did, please drop a like down below. It really means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which books you think would also be great for Frankenstein fans. I'm currently in my winter gothic era, so I'm on the lookout for more similar books. And if you're new here, please subscribe. I make videos chatting about all things books. Feel free to also follow me on my socials. I have a Goodreads where I rate what I read there, and I also have an Instagram. I post more personal things on there, but I also rate the books that I've read, letting you know what about and what I rate them out of 5 stars. Please also let me know if you have any film or TV shows that you want me to make book recommendations on. I was thinking about doing one for Stranger Things, but I wasn't too sure in light of all the controversy regarding the actors, but please let me know if you want one on that. And if not that, let me know which shows you would like one on. Thank you so much for watching, and also thank you for waiting for me whilst my eyes healed after my laser eye surgery. I very much appreciate your patience. Believe me, it is so nice to be able to see everything in HD without glasses or contacts because it was always a struggle filming videos with contacts or just going blind. With that being said, I love you and I will see you in the next one. Bye.